Okay, here we go. So we are officially live. So thank you so much. So hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Dr. Tara Tuesdays. It is officially Dr. Tara Thursdays. Only certain people can make us change the whole day of the week, a segment. And tonight we have one of those people here, Dr. Briana Boyd, who is a brilliant clinical psychologist, all the way joining us all the way from California. So I feel honored to have her on. And she's on here to talk about a lane that she knows oh so well. Her background is in clinical psychology. I'll let her introduce herself to the Dr. Tara community. But one of the things that we did about a month or so ago is we asked for viewer's choice. And we had such an overwhelming response around the topic of co-parenting with a narcissist, Dr. Briana. And so I wanted to bring a true expert, someone who has really solidified their place in the field. So welcome to the Dr. Tara community. We are a safe community. If you're just joining us, let us know that you're on here. One of the things that I just want to let everyone know is that I have some questions planned for Dr. Briana, but as always, you all are welcome to bring in your comments and your questions, and she will try to do her best to answer them. So Dr. Briana, please introduce yourself to the Dr. Tara community, who you are, what your specialization is, before we get started.
Oh, great. Hi. Thank you so much for having me, yeah. Dr. Tara. I'm Dr. Bree, Dr. Briana Boyd. I have a few specialties. The first is post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm a post-traumatic stress disorder expert. I also have a specialty in anxiety. And then I have this like really niche subspecialty, and it is living with narcissism and surviving basically narcissism. So I work with a lot of people who have family members with narcissism, partners with narcissism, children with narcissism. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Just a little bit more about me professionally. So Dr. Tara and I went to school together, right? We got our PhDs together. And since that time, I moved out to California, and I'm a clinical psychologist with a private practice in town, very bustling private practice, which is really great. I'm also a professor at San Diego State University, where I teach a stress management course, and I also teach a trauma course for graduate students, as well as a self-love, self-compassion course that I've designed there, which is pretty cool. And then the last thing I do is I do subject matter experts. So I work in the forensic realm. So I go and testify in trials regarding post-traumatic stress disorder. So just a little bit about what I do. And then I love to do talks like this. So just a little bit.
So again, only the best for the Dr. Tara community. As y'all can see, she is qualified. And so I just want to jump right into it. The topic is so meaty. Yes. And the term, I just want to start from the very beginning. The term narcissist is something that is almost trendy now in our society. People are, quick to label someone as a narcissist, or this person is a narcissist, or this person is a narcissist. So can you just break down what this actually means to have the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, some of the symptoms that a person may experience, what narcissism is and what it is not?
Okay, that's a great question. It's an important place to start. So I think that the DSM is where this really falls short here, when we have to diagnose in such discrete categorical terms. The reality is this: the hallmark feature of narcissism. So we have narcissistic personality disorder, but the hallmark feature of narcissism is a trouble with empathy, or lapses in empathy. So we're going to talk very specifically about what empathy is. And so I think of sort of narcissism as ice cream, and narcissistic personality disorder would be rocky road. Borderline personality disorder would be strawberry. Okay. Antisocial personality disorder would be mint chocolate chip. All right. So, but it's all ice cream. Okay. And so the hallmark feature is a lapse of empathy, or struggles with empathy, or no empathy. Now, empathy is a very specific trait. Okay. And I think of it as like a sense organ, right? So we have eyes to take in the other. We have ears to take in the other. We can smell the other. And empathy is a way we can sense the other. Right. And so the way the definition of empathy is understanding or imagining somebody else's experience in relation to the self. So like that I can imagine you, Dr. Tara's experience in relation to me right now. Okay. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about narcissism. Narcissism is a struggle with empathy, a struggle to feel the other. It's not remorse. It's not sympathy. It's not compassion. People can have remorse and trouble with empathy. Okay. A really good example is this ring. Okay. I love this ring. It's very fancy. I didn't know I could love a ring so much, right? I love the ring. I care for the ring. If something happened, I'd be very sad that something happened to the ring, but I don't really think about what it's like for the ring to be on my finger every day. So I take the ring where I want to take it. I clean it when I feel like cleaning it. but I'm not really connected deeply to the ring's experience apart and aside from my own experience of the ring.
Mm-hmm. And that's how a narcissist would experience someone else. Like, great, I can care about you, but that experience that you have, I can't connect with. Correct. And so, like, yeah, so it's really that lack in connection. And so,
wait, let me really, really quickly too. And so, without empathy, the problem is that I can connect to your experience through mine. So if I think it's fine, you think it's fine, right? If I think you should have known, you should have known. If I'm happy, you're happy. If I'm sad, you're sad. There's like a lack of separateness. And empathy is really holding a separate space. Like, you're having a different experience than I'm having. Without empathy, there's no separateness. And without separateness, there's no sense of the other. And so then I project my experience onto you, and I don't even recognize it. Just like I project my experience onto the ring.
And I love what you said too, because that also can include, like, one of the things that came up for me that someone DM'd me about is, if they're over it, they think that I should be over it. They don't understand. Yes.
I can't tell you how many times I've worked with people, and I've even had my own personal experiences of, like, the table gets flipped, I'm covered in goo, and then they're like, hey, let's go for a walk. And you're like, oh, like, still dripping wet with the food you threw all over me. And so when I'm fine, you're fine. When I'm not fine. And then there's like a you should know. Like, of course, because there's no separate sense of self, and that's the empathy piece. And here's the really important part that I think is so critical. This is not their fault. People with narcissism are not bad people. They're born with a sense organ deficit, right? People who have visual impairment are not bad people, okay? People who have hearing impairment are not bad people. People who have an empathic impairment are not bad people. It is not their fault. They're not doing it on purpose. They don't have the organ that they need to feel you. Okay? But these are good people doing their best with a sense organ cut off.
So then how does somebody know? What would be some telltale signs other than what you said that, you know what, I think I'm dealing with someone with narcissistic personality disorder?
This is a really good question. I think we're going to move away from narcissistic personality disorder. I think it's just broader than that. We're going to talk about empathy. Here's the thing. This is my own way of looking at this, like, through all the things I've seen, but narcissism can span a spectrum, right? What I think, so obviously it can span a spectrum of intensity, how severe it is, but it also can range in intensity from benevolent to really, really toxic, okay? So funny enough, somebody can be really, really, really generous, kind, loving. I think a lot of this, like, a political figureheads can be this way, benevolent, but don't have empathy, right? And then people can be really, really toxic, horribly manipulative, really, really abusive, and not have empathy, right? So this empathy thing can span, you can have a benevolent narcissist and you can also have a really toxic narcissist. And so the level of toxicity in the narcissism would be important to consider when we're thinking about how to deal with a narcissist. So then ask me that question again, sweetie, with that, like, understanding that spectrum.
Right. So then what are some signs? So as I'm looking, if I'm working or if I'm living with a benevolent or co-parenting with someone with a benevolent form of narcissism, meaning that they're still kind, they're still showing up, they're still present, versus that toxic one, what are my red flags?
Okay, my red flags
as we go along these stages.
Especially with the red flags are a lot redder and fly a lot higher with people who are on more the toxic end. And
definitely.
So that's important to talk about the span. The telltale sign is this: somebody does not respond in a way that would otherwise be very expected to respond. And it's usually about an experience you're having. I'll give you a very good example. I was on, I'm trying to think. I have a great example, but I don't know if I want to say it on Facebook Live. So let me try to. So let's say that you're out with your boyfriend. You go to a football game he really wants to go to. Okay. You go to the football. You don't really want to go to the football game, but you go to the football game. You think it's going to make him happy, right? On the way out of the stadium, you slip down the stairs and you break your arm. Okay. And so now you would imagine that a boyfriend would respond how?
He would, hey, let's go to the hospital. Let's make sure you're okay. Let's get you checked out.
Who should the night become about in that moment?
Me. It should become about my well-being, my care. Right.
Okay. So a good red flag is like when a very obvious moment of caretaking arises and the person is just not there. Like, so they might be like, okay, it's frustrating me that it's taking you so long to get out of the stadium. And you're like, I just fell down the stairs at the game you brought me to, right? And then frustrated as we're sitting at the hospital. Ugh, I'm so frustrated. And then, on the way home, you got to stop and get drugs at the drugstore, pain medication. And they're like, I'm just over it. I've had a long day. And you're like, you had a long day? I broke my hand coming down, right? So those moments where somebody, or like, I had an example with a patient who's, they were having a lot of like physical pains, and their mom just like didn't see it. Like, just, I'm very sweet about it, but it was just like, okay, well, I'm gonna go sit in the garden. Just let me know if you need anything, which would be really odd for a mother.
Right.
In that moment. So even though she's not being abusive or mean or toxic, it's like these moments. Another good telltale sign is that sense of like, it's over when it's over. Like, I'm done, you're done. Right? I'm done, you're done. Another sense, this is a telltale sign, splitting. The all good, all bad, all right, all wrong. People who are, it's called borderline organization. This is important too. Narcissism, the ice cream, is borderline organization. That's what we really call it in the field conceptually. It's called borderline organization because these people are thought to be organized on the borderline between crazy and sane. So narcissism is like kind of half crazy, half sane. So half the time people can be unbelievably reasonable. Half the time they can be somewhat delusional to very delusional. Right?
Wow.
But the empathy piece doesn't change.
Right. The empathy piece doesn't change.
Even when they're being reasonable, there's no empathy. And again, empathy is not no remorse. People can have trouble with empathy and still be sympathetic. People can have trouble with empathy and still be remorseful. Right? I know someone who struggles with empathy who is like the biggest undocumented advocate. And that person cares deeply for the experiences of undocumented folks. But does not have the capacity to understand what it's like to be in relation to them.
Right.
That interpersonal.
Christina has a comment, or a question. She said, is there any truth in that people who have a lot of empathy attract narcissists?
Yes. Because basically what we do is we care deeply that these people, are struggling, or that they have their problems, and also oftentimes people with empathy, with high empathy, have terrible boundaries because the guilt is so thick and deep. And so we're going to have to do a segment.
Say that one more time.
People who are ultra empathic tend to have terrible boundaries because the feeling of guilt is so strong, or the feeling to want to help is so compelling. And so we have to be really careful. I'm a dripping empath, and I have spent the last 15 years cultivating hardcore boundaries. And when we talk about dealing and living successfully in relationships with folks who have narcissism, the key feature is going to be boundaries. 100% about how it's going to get managed.
Yes. And one of the things, just so everyone knows, the boundary piece about this is so deep that Dr. Briana has already agreed to come on and do a part 2 just around setting boundaries, especially for those of us who are empathic, who care, who feel, who are emotional, who want to, who become fixers in relationships rather than partners. Right. And so my frustration comes out of my need to fix and not being able to. So when we think about, so many people are so true, so real, that's true.
Yes.
Into this topic. So the topic of co-parenting with a narcissist was one of the most popular that we have to cover.
Yeah.
But as it relates to all things co-parenting, the schedules, discipline, blah, blah, blah. How can, and I think you're going to touch on it as it relates to boundaries, but how can a parent navigate this terrain with a person with narcissism?
Okay.
How do I even begin that navigation?
So the first navigation is truly understanding that it's not this person's fault. They are not bad people. They are born with a deficit. Okay. So it's really, if we can connect to a place of compassion, it's going to be helpful. But the people, let me ask you a fun question. Do you think people with really great boundaries have more or less compassion for others? People with really great boundaries have more or less compassion for others?
We probably have more. Because I care about you to say, I'm going to protect you. Boundaries for me is protection. I'm protecting you and I'm protecting myself.
Correct. Boundaries preserve the relationship. People think that boundaries are relationship breakers. They're relationship preservers because resentment are relationship breakers. Okay. And so it's just really—
hold on. We're going to say that again. Boundaries are relationship preservers because without boundaries, it leads to resentment, which is relationship breakers. Yes. Now, we'll put that on the t-shirt too, Dr. Boyd.
Drinking poison. I mean, having poor boundaries is drinking poison and sucking it down in the relationship. And over time, this thing is going to, it's gonna catch up with you. So in dealing with a narcissist, people with narcissism, I like to kind of not be so stigmatizing the label. People with narcissism, it's important to remember it's not their fault. Just like if somebody had a visual impairment, it would be important to remember, even if there was times in your life that created additional effort, right? You understand that absolutely this is not this person's fault. Okay. The word narcissistic is so like bad, mastermind plotting. These people are not masterminding. They are not plotting. They are literally born with a deck that has a little less cards in it, and they are playing their best sweet hand. Okay, so I really think it's important to understand that. When you're co-parenting with someone with narcissism, it's going to be really important. People who are super empathic tend to make appeals to others' emotions because it's so appealing to us. Right. And so when I'm working with somebody who's got some narcissism, I need to be careful not to try to appeal to emotions by trying to induce guilt or narcissism. They don't have empathy, but they can sit with a ton of shame. Okay. Talk about shame really quick. It's a really important emotion to understand. We can't get too deeply into it, but quite simply, if you think about any emotion, I want you to think about a beam of light pointing across the room, and depending on the way the beam is oriented, you can predict where the beam will end up on the other side of the room. It's just a straight line. Okay. Shame is an emotion, and you can predict, right? Shame is an emotion that almost acts as a prism, where you like dip it in the beam and the light refracts everywhere, and all of a sudden it's unpredictable and you're not sure what you're going to get. Okay. So when you're working with shame, you got to understand that shame will make people do really wild things, and people will protect and defend against shame, and they should. Okay, so we want to make sure that we don't make appeals to emotions like guilt, because they're not going to feel the guilt, right, separate and apart from themselves. But it could trigger shame, and when you trigger shame, you're going to get a lot of acting out behavior. You're going to get a lot of defensiveness, and egos must defend themselves. We say defensive; it gets such a bad rap. The reality is, egos must and will defend themselves. And so, when we're working with people with narcissism, we want to be sure that we are not trying to appeal to the emotion or not trying to lay on guilt. And what we do want to do, it's very, 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 it's simple but not easy, is we need to set boundaries. People do what works and they stop doing what doesn't work, right? So vending machines teach us incredible boundaries, right? Vending machines teach us like, okay, come to me, put $1 in, hit a button, and you can get what you want from me. So it's shaping our behavior. You can't just put $1 in, you'll just stand there. It won't give you what you want. Right? You can't just hit a button, it'll just stand there. You can't, and we don't hate vending machines. You know, we think, oh my God, if I set boundaries, everyone's gonna hate me. We love vending machines. We live for vending machines, right? So, but vending machines teach us how to get what it wants from us, right? And so it's very important that when we're dealing with co-parenting with narcissism, we need to understand that people do what works and they don't do what doesn't work. Okay? So we want to set boundaries, and we want to stop doing things we don't want to do, because if we stop doing them, people will stop trying to get that from us, just like a vending machine. If I go to the vending machine, I put my $1 and I hit the button, I usually get what I want, and it stops working. Immediately, I'm going to have an extinction burst. I'm going to bang this vending machine, right? And if that finally doesn't work, I'm going to walk away, and I'm not going to go to that vending machine for those sodas anymore.
One of the things that I often talk about too is, like, when you talk about setting boundaries, that means that I'm implementing a change, and that change is going to feel bad to me too. So if I'm an empath, right, I'm going to feel bad about setting this boundary. I'm going to question myself. It's going to be uncomfortable for me, because that's a muscle that I have to strengthen.
Correct.
And so letting people know that the first person I'm setting the boundary with is myself.
Yep.
And I'm a big believer of, don't set boundaries that you know you're not going to keep.
100%.
You know, I have to you have to come up by 6 o'clock, and I know I'm going to let them go at 15. 6 o'clock isn't the boundary. Start with what is easiest that I know that I can enforce too. And I think sometimes as empaths, people can become so fed up, like, you know what, I'm shutting everything down. Works for that day, and I get into this power struggle, but then I go right back to regress. I want to go to Dennis's question really quickly.
Sure. I want to get back to that question about what do empaths do about setting the boundary, being uncomfortable. I have a really good answer for that.
Okay, so then let's go to your response to that, and then I'll go to his question.
That sounds great. Okay, so really, really quickly, pack animals, we're pack animals. Humans are pack animals, right? Dogs are pack animals. Orca are pack animals. Pack animals have evolved with elaborate emotional systems. It's really important so we can feel the other, right? And so if I walk up on the pack and the pack looks scared, I can read the pack, right? Guilt is a pro-social emotion in pack animals. All pack animals have guilt. We see dogs look guilty. Have you ever seen that? A dog eats something at you. You know, a dog's guilty. You see the whites of their eyes, right? So all pack animals have guilt, right? But guilt is an indicator, nothing more, nothing less. Nature selects guilt in pack animals because it nudges us. It's such a terrible feeling inside that it becomes a really powerful internal motivator to get us to go repair if we've done something wrong, okay? So we're supposed to feel guilt. It keeps us in the pack. If we keep transgressing with the pack, and then we feel no guilt about it, we don't repair, that can get us in a lot of trouble in the pack over time, okay? So nature selects guilt in pack animals, and us empaths who are setting boundaries for the first time, what we need to do is when we feel guilty, I've worked so much on guilt that now I understand guilt solely as a functional emotion, okay? When I feel guilty, it's a terrible feeling. I ask myself, I check in with myself and I ask myself, did I do something bad to somebody besides say no thank you? Okay. If the answer is yes, I want to use this powerful internal motivator to go fix it. I want to go there. That's what it's for. Okay. If I haven't done anything bad to anybody simply besides say no thank you, my job is to tolerate the guilt. So I'm supposed to check in with myself, go, you're a good person. It's okay to say no. We always want to set boundaries really kindly so that when we go back over it and we feel really guilty, we can say, no, I was really, really kind. I was really, really sweet, but I also said no, thank you. I'm allowed to say no, thank you. I'm a good person. This guilt will pass. And you're going to need like a boundary buddy. You're going to need someone to call. You're oh my God, I feel like the worst person in the world. And they're going to go, nah, girl, you got it. Keep going. Okay. Or a therapist or somebody, right? But so that's how we really, and that's what when we start to set boundaries with the narcissist in our life, you're going to get a big pushback if you've been vending reliably like that vending machine. We're going to start banging the vending machine. But if I vend when somebody starts banging, what do I teach them?
Continue to bang as long as they blow up, and I'm going to give in.
So bang, and you'll get what you want from me. So if you buckle in the middle of an explosion, because there's a lot of explosion with narcissism, people have a hard time self-regulating, so they have explosive anger. If you buckle in the middle of an explosion, you are guaranteed bigger, longer, and more explosions in the future. Okay. So I like what you said, decide to set the boundary and keep it, because if you keep the boundary, even if it gets really, really, really escalated, eventually it will stop. If you buckle, you will teach this person, go harder, higher, faster, longer, and eventually you'll get what you want from me. So you're actually going to shape worse and worse behavior. It's better to say, I'm too tired to set a boundary right now, and then set it later and hold on to it with all your might, than to set it, have the behavior escalate, and then give in.
Good. So listening to that, Dennis asked the question, because it ranges, and I think this goes back to the ice cream analogy, could everyone have a degree of narcissism in them?
I love this question. The answer is absolutely. Okay. All of us have narcissism. So it's a continuum. It's a developmental continuum. And so I won't get too crazy, but it's like there's the somatic, and then there's the psychotic, and then there's depressed, and then there's borderline, organization, and then there's neurotic. Okay. Neurotic sounds crazy, but it's actually really healthy. It's empathy that starts to make us neurotic. It's imagining what the other might think about us that starts to make us crazy in our head in a particular type of way. Okay. But because it's a spectrum, everybody who's neurotic, healthy, has come through narcissism. So we can go back right through narcissism. And so depending on how we're doing or feeling, we can get really narcissistic at times. The difference between people who are narcissists, who we would call narcissist, and the rest of us is that they're sort of fixed there.
Right.
They don't move up to neurotic, but they do sort of straddle the line. They can be really, 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 really healthy. But all of us have the capacity to be narcissistic. I've learned in the pandemic that I actually like doing puzzles with my husband. And I realized a point where I didn't have a ton of empathy for him, imagining what it's like to be him in relation to me, right? And what I realized is we're looking for these puzzle pieces, and when it was like really hard to find the puzzle piece, I'm like, I'll just let him find it. He's going to find it. And he's so good at finding them. He's obsessive and he hates it. I'm like sending him on a wild goose chase, right? But instead of thinking about how much he hates looking for the puzzle pieces and how much he's going to do it just because they're there, right? I go, I'm just going to think about what I want and need. So I'm just going to stop looking because I know he'll look for it. I'm not thinking about like, wow, it's going to make him crazy to look for that thing, right? But I don't feel like looking for it. He'll find it, right? And so I ended up noticing that and apologizing. I said, baby, you know what I realized? I always leave you the hard stuff. I'll be halfway through something and be like, this sucks. I'll leave it for him. That's not a very empathic experience of mine, right? So all of us have the capacity to demonstrate narcissism, and especially when we don't feel good. Mm-hmm. Drug addiction can have a lot of narcissism, and when we're really struggling with very intense symptoms of mental illness, we can be somewhat narcissistic. We can lose our perspective of the other because we're hurting so badly.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to Nikki's comment before I go back to the question. So when we were talking about setting the boundary, she brought up, how do you avoid the confrontation? And my question, I want to add to that, is avoiding the confrontation what you're looking for? Or is it because sometimes you're going to get the confrontation when you set that boundary?
Let's rephrase that. You are always going to get. Okay. Nobody walks up to a vending machine they've been going to for a year, puts $1 in, hits C4, doesn't get a Coke and walks away. Nobody does that. Okay. It's all about behavior shape. And that's why boundaries are the critical piece of this. And so you will get pushback. Here's what I recommend. This is what I did when I was setting boundaries. I come to you so humbly with this work. I had no boundaries when we met. I worked for years with my therapist to get boundaries. And if Mirta sees this, she'll be so proud of me. Hi, Mirta. But you will. So all of us do this. Imagine getting in the car, right? And you turn the engine. Every time you turn the engine, the engine turns, right? If you get in your car and you turn that key and the engine doesn't turn, you don't just get out. You start turning and turning and turning and turning and turning. And so you will get an extinction burst. That's called an extinction burst, a slight uptick in a temporary uptick in behavior before the behavior vanishes. Okay. And so all of us, we teach people that we are a good place to get a need met. When we stop meeting the need, people don't just skip off, right? They're going to shake us down for the need. So you will always, unless you're in a relationship that's very well boundaried, which is not what we're talking about here. Right. Right. I could say to you, right, Dr. T, I could say to you, sweetie, this isn't going to work for me this Thursday. Let's do next Thursday. Right. And you're going to go, oh, of course. Right. So in well-boundaried relationships, you're not going to see that pushback. But in relationships without boundaries, even if the person doesn't have narcissism, people can have boundaries and push on your boundaries because you're easy to get stuff from, not because they're terrible people. Right. And so we will always get pushback. And so what I recommend is giving everybody in your life a little orientation. That's what I did when I started setting boundaries. I went all my housemates, right? T and Jacob, I was like, hey, y'all. So I found out I got no boundaries. And they were like, yeah, we could have told you that, right? I found out I got no boundaries. I'm going to be setting boundaries. I'm going to be saying no more. And almost every single person in my life said, absolutely, we will help you with that. Okay. And so then when you start to set the boundary, you go, hey, remember that thing I told you I was going to do? We're doing it right now. And you remember you said you'd be supportive. This is your opportunity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you can even have compassion. I know this is hard for you. Like, I really understand that this is a big change for you, but we're not doing this anymore.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you said, when we talk about setting boundaries, again, my thing is, I want to set boundaries when I'm within my complex. Like you said, I may need to take a nap. I may need to go to sleep and revisit this boundary. 100%. I'm not going to set this boundary when I'm flying off the handle, as one that I know that I want to keep. I'm asking the question, are children more likely to have narcissism or experience narcissism if they have a parent that is?
I can't tell you that I know the research on this. And what I've seen from my clinical practice is it seems to be an extreme split, like either that they can be narcissistic or they're a hardcore empath. Mm-hmm. So children will often become the reciprocal of their parent. Right. Children will often become whatever their parents need them to become to make this thing balanced and complementary. And here's the thing. Again, this is my professional opinion. It's not like I'm like the end all be all. There's a kind of a debate in the field. I believe that narcissism has a genetic underpinning. Some people will tell you it's 100% environmental. And so because I believe there's a genetic underpinning, I do think that children could be more likely to be narcissistic if their parents are narcissistic. Also, we develop empathy through being seen by the other. Mm-hmm. Right. So when you have a child and you see the child is sad and you're not sad and you say to the child, oh, you look sad. Right. It's like your mother seeing myself being seen by my mother. Right. Mm-hmm. So when children aren't reflected in the eyes of their parent, they may not learn to reflect others in their own eyes. Right. Right. But also, if you have a child can be born of a person with narcissism, and then they need to kind of like take up all the emotional slack. Mm-hmm. So it's like, and so I always say that nature plots the bandwidth. And then nurture plots you along the band. One thing Brene Brown says that I like is nature loads the gun, nurture pulls the trigger. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Love it. It takes both. Yeah. I can't tell you. I mean, countless stories of people who are siblings who have one narcissistic sibling and the other child is the utter empath. Right. And I've also heard lots of stories where the only abuse in the house came from the narcissistic child, and so the child was raised by two empathic parents and abused the empathic parents and abused other siblings in the house. And so that child didn't grow up with the conditions that breed narcissism. And so there has to be some kind of a genetic component to it. And then just have a lot of compassion that child ended up with that limitation, right? In a household full of people who don't have it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how does a parent, and this goes into Sean's question, so say you have a parent who has narcissistic personality disorder and one who does not. How, as that parent who does not, or the parent who does, right? Because like you said, I'm a good person, right? This is an imbalance. how do you balance that or aim to try and make sure that you're not raising a child who may experience narcissism themselves?
Okay, so here's the thing. We're all going to experience narcissism ourselves. Right. And kids are like narcissistic until they're like 25. Okay, I'm mostly joking, right? But we can't even diagnose a personality disorder, a borderline organization. We can't even diagnose that until somebody's 18 because we're all very narcissistic as adolescents. We're so self-focused. I remember my dad passed away when I was little. It took me a long time. I mean, I must have been in my 20s. And one day, I'll never forget it. It struck me when I was like, oh my God, I wonder what it was like for my mom to lose her husband. But I was not thinking about that when I was losing my dad. When I was 11, it was like I was the central focus of my experience. I had no empathy for I cared about my mom, I loved my mom, but I couldn't imagine what it was like to be her in that situation. I think it was after I fell in love for the first time that I thought this must have been awful for my mother to lose someone she loved, right? And so we are absolutely all going to have narcissism. Our kids are going to have it too. In dealing with a parent that's narcissistic, I think it's really important. Of course, age-appropriate conversations are important, but there's nothing bad or wrong about somebody with narcissism. It's a deficit. So I think it's really important in families that it be talked about like it's a deficit and there's not something evil, wrong, or bad. And so
look at what your dad is doing or your mom is bad. Yeah, like we don't want to split.
You got it. So you can teach your child about this. And it's important too, because part of the phenomenon of gaslighting, right, comes up when we talk about narcissism. And we'll get there. I know we'll get there a little later, but acting like your partner is not struggling with narcissism to your child is a form of gaslighting. Wow. Your child is like, I'm having this experience. That mom just flipped the table. I'm sitting here dripping in milk and you're trying to tell me everything's fine. Right? So it's important that we kind of are the buffer for our children if we have a narcissistic parent. We want to say like, so-and-so struggles with empathy. It's not your fault. I saw it the way you saw it, and then really acting like it's true that this parent has a deficit instead of being like, acting like it's not true and leaving this poor child to keep trying to attempt or appeal to emotions. Or it's like, no, you picked this person to have a baby with. You have to be the go-between, right? And like kind of buffer that and validate your child's experience, say, and what's it like when you're not always felt by your father, or what's it like when your mom can't always see how you feel, and it's okay to be upset about that, and we can talk about that, and they're not a bad person, and they love you, they just have a limitation.
I think this goes into Maya's comment or question. For me, therapy is such an important part, or would be such an important recommendation, because sometimes as the parent, if I'm feeling pushback from this person, it may be hard for me to be with my child, right? I may be exhibiting some narcissism towards my child because I can't believe that you would treat me like this. And so I can't be with my child because I'm projecting my feelings onto them. Can you believe that they did this? Or, and so having a therapist or having some type of outside objective person that can say, what does it feel like when you experience this? Or what does it feel like when your parents are going in this back and forth, so that they can have a chance to process their feelings as well?
Yes. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we want to talk about it now, but I think it's really important to talk about validation and shame. I don't know if we need to talk about that now, but there's a big correlation. I think part of the struggle of dealing with somebody or living with somebody or loving somebody who doesn't have empathy is that you don't get validated. It's like, this hurt me. No, it didn't. Because it didn't hurt them, right? And so we seek validation, and it's normal and healthy. And when we're not validated, it can make us pretty angry and pretty unraveled pretty quickly. If you tried to tell me that I didn't eat what I ate for breakfast this morning, I would be pretty upset pretty quickly. I'm like, I had pancakes and bacon. And you're like, no, you didn't. And I'm like, yes, I did. I was there. I made it. It was delicious. I put blueberries and bananas. No, you didn't, right? I'd be like, wow, you can't, right? So it doesn't take much to get us there when we're not being validated. And when we're dealing with a partner with narcissism and they hurt our feelings, we want to be validated and seen, right? And we want them to take responsibility. But the thing is that when we're dealing with narcissism, we're dealing with a pretty big shame structure, like I mentioned, okay? And so when we are seeking validation, we want to be careful not to couch it in like you did something bad or wrong, because then that's going to elicit shame. Mm-hmm. And then shame causes people to hide, look away, defend. And so you're going to get less validation, less of an apology, and even more of a doubling down in the defense. No, I didn't hurt your feelings. No, but it's normal for somebody to want validation. So if you're seeking validation, just know that like it's important to try to do it in a way that doesn't incite shame or guilt, just saying like, and it's much more important to just take a behavioral approach. You said that thing to me, it wasn't cool. Don't talk to me like that.
Right. I feel statements. I felt sad when you said such and such.
I would drop the I feel. Okay. I would say, do not speak to me that way. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter how I feel because the person
can't relate and can't connect.
You feel what I feel. I'm happy, you're happy. If I'm sad, you're sad. So I wouldn't even start with an I feel statement. That's going to be I don't mean it to be an insensitive example, but it's like, playing the drums with somebody who's, audibly impaired. I don't know how much they're going to hear that.
Right.
So, I mean that with all due respect and loving kindness. And in fact, I think it's a bit cruel to play the drums for somebody who can't hear it and then grade them on the performance.
Their performance.
So, appealing to emotions and then trying to get people and shaming them for not giving validation or feeling, like, in a way they don't have the sense organ to perceive it. So it's kind of cruel to like shove their face in this thing they can't do.
So when you did this, you're not going to allow that anymore.
Yeah. You're not going to talk to me anymore. You're not going to talk. You're not going to call me a bitch anymore. When you call me a bitch, I'm going to leave the room. Period.
The end.
And I'll do it kindly. Listen, I love you. I love spending time with you. I think you're great. You're not going to call me a bitch anymore. You call me a bitch again, I'm leaving the room. I love you. Is that clear? Good. I set incredible boundaries with my nephews. It is so funny. I want to buy that toy. Baby, I love you so much. I'm not buying you a toy. You ready to go? But I want the toy. I love you. You're not getting it. Let's go.
You mentioned something that I want to talk about because, again, people bring this up too in the cliche way. So the term gaslighting, this person is gaslighting me. One, can we break that down, what that is and what it is not? And how do I navigate through that?
Okay, good. This is back to the validation piece. Okay, right. So interestingly enough, the term comes from an old movie from I think it's like the 20s, it might be the 30s. A really interesting movie. It's like a psychological thriller, and it's about a young woman who gets married to a man who is basically a psychopath. And they move into her aunt, the young bride's aunt passes away, and they move into the aunt's house, the young couple. And so she's a housewife, she stays at home. And the husband goes out to work all day. And when the wife is home by herself all day, she sees the gaslight going on and off in the house. And she starts to think that the house might be haunted. And so she starts to think she's going crazy. And so her husband would come home from work. He would say, the gaslight was going on and off today all by itself. And he was like, no, that's not happening. You're crazy. And then she would go, no, but this is happening. And because it was really happening. And so the story turns out that the man was actually turning the gaslight on and off. And the woman ends up absolutely going crazy, and she ends up in a mental hospital, and it's like this terrible, terrible outcome. And so gaslighting is essentially the activity of like, somebody is having their experience and it's being denied by the other. It's completely being denied and or rewritten by the other. But here's what's really important. That's done from a place of defense, not some maniacal mastermind sitting on the top of a mountain trying to, systematically ruin your life. It's like they have a hard time seeing your reality. Right. And then to see your reality is really, really difficult for them, but they're not denying your reality because they hate you. And when they see if they can glean your reality for just a second and it brings them to utter shame, they're going to have to look away from that too. Right. So the movie depicts like this very intentional, like,
person and this is my
mental abuse of another, when in fact most gaslighting occurs as a defense of the narcissistic structure, not as some very intentional thing to harm you. Yeah.
Well, then understanding that, and Chandra asked a question that I'm going to connect with this too. How can a person with narcissism impact their children? And as a parent, as a parent with narcissism who loves my child, and as a co-parent of a partner with narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, what safety measures can be put in place to protect this child?
Again, the empathic parent needs to act as though the other parent has a deficit. Right. And so that's the most important piece. We don't, if the narcissistic parent is having a really tough day and they have been and they've been really dysregulated because they've had a lot of stress in their day, we're not going to stick to the co-parenting, drop off just because it's Tuesday. Right. Like being able, if that's flexible, just instead of being like, well, I don't want to have too much trouble with your dad and I don't want to have too much trouble with this and that. So you're going to go and sit in this thing I know is really bad for you. Right. Because I just don't feel like dealing with it. It's like, again, we chose these people to have children with. And so we really kind of have to pull up all the responsibility in that regard. And so it might also be interesting. This is really interesting. People who have empathy are horrified at the notion of not having empathy. People without empathy are not that horrified by the notion of not having empathy. I cannot tell you how many times I've sat in couple sessions and so says, so-and-so is narcissistic. And then they look at me and then the other one looks at me and they go, yeah, I think I am. I said, well, narcissism is a struggle with empathy. They go, yeah, I think I have that. Right. So empaths, because we can imagine the experience of the other in relation to us, we're horrified when we think about being narcissistic. Right. But people without empathy are not horrified by it. So you can actually talk to the narcissistic parent about it. I don't know if I would use the term narcissistic, but I might say something like, sometimes you see black and white or, and I would do this when they're calm. Right. And sometimes, you can go from 0 to 60. Can we come up with like a safe word when you're really struggling and really being compassionate with the person in the moment? I find that one of the hardest things in the world is having compassion for someone who does not have compassion for me. It's really tough, right? And so when somebody's having a really tough day and they're really going for you, it's really hard to sit back and be like, wow, this person has a deficit, right? Meanwhile, you're covered in milk. And so I think it's really important that we are honest with our kids, with ourselves, and the person with narcissism about the condition. You can talk to them about it. They will survive it. They'll be like, oh yeah, I totally have that. And then we can talk about how much they truly love the child. Right. Mm-hmm. And then we can talk about like on days that they're really struggling, what can we do to support you? Mm-hmm. How can we best protect the children when you're really struggling? And can you get in touch with yourself enough to tell me that? And therapy works wonders. Even if you're co-parenting separately, we can all still have a lot of therapy.
Right. Because I think too, it also goes into understanding what we need in that moment as well. And one of the things that I've seen people struggle with is that if I give empathy to someone else or if I give compassion to someone else, it's taking something from me. I then become weak or I then feel like I'm giving in, And so one of the things that you mentioned first, when you first started about boundaries with ourselves, that importance of our own self-talk. If I'm that co-parent, right, that other co-parent. And so can you speak about what might be some phrases or some techniques that, this person is being difficult and I want to look at them compassionately, but it's hurting my feelings. I feel bad. I feel guilty. How do I navigate through that as well?
Yeah. So I truly believe that aside from like real heavy hitters of mental diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, narcissism, I truly believe that our biggest mental problems are the relationships we have with ourselves, like 100% bred out of the relationships we have with ourselves. And so I think first of all, it's really important for us to give ourselves that validation. Because we're not going to get it from the person who can't see our experience apart and aside from their own. So it's going to be really important to be like, I'm not crazy. Mm-hmm. That went down the way I think it went down. Okay, that's like number one. It's like, no, they flipped the table. I'm covered in milk. That was not cool. They're acting like we're fine now. I'm not fine now. And that's okay that I'm not fine now. I don't have to be fine now. You can actually ask for a little bit of space too. You know what, sweetie, I know you feel better. I'm still struggling a little bit. I'm going to take some time. Mm-hmm. Not even like I feel so you need to. It's just like, we're going to do this. I'm setting the boundary. You don't get a choice. I'm going to take some time. But the self-talk is going to be critical. Give yourself the validation. That's key. Also telling yourself, I'm doing a good job. This is really, 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 really hard. Mm-hmm. Here's the thing too. As you start to make changes in relationships and as you start to set boundaries, if you're doing it well, it will feel awful. So keeping that in mind when you're talking to yourself as well. Like, I'm doing a good job. If it can look terrible, but it doesn't mean you're not doing a really, really, really good job. And if nothing changes, nothing changes. So if it all looks the same, you're probably not doing much to change it, which is okay too. Having your own boundaries to say, I can't deal with this today, or I'm not going to, make a lot of changes. But I think talking to your children about narcissism, there's some good books out there on boundaries and narcissism. There's one that's called I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. I think that's a pretty good layperson's book. But yeah, so just really being honest with yourself, validating yourself, being kind to yourself, telling yourself you're doing a good job, telling yourself that this is really hard. Assuring yourself that if you continue to set boundaries, things will get better. Mm-hmm. Talking to friends, therapy is, again, I can't tell you, finding a specialist who understands narcissism, who can really support you and really validate you. Go, wow, you were covered in milk, weren't you? Right. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that people are talking about in the comments is at what point, and this goes back into what you said about that narcissism going on that spectrum. Yes. And just looking at Chandra's comment, they do things like, that splitting, your mom is taking me to court, your mom is why I can't see you or call you, or setting a visitation and then constantly changing it, or telling a child if they don't want to be here, they can leave. And so what people are talking about in the comments is, at what point does this become abuse? And someone even said, working with a client, another therapist, where clients are a shell of themselves after surviving a relationship with a person with narcissism. And so how do you navigate that and go back into yourself? And again, understanding where that person is from, that benevolent narcissism, that you talked about, to that toxic and abusive narcissism, both of which are very real ends of that spectrum.
Absolutely. And both benevolent narcissism can be really insidious because you think you're going crazy. These people are really sweet to you. They're really, really nice to you and just won't meet your needs, just cannot see your needs. That happens a lot in relationships, loving relationships and parent relationships. Like, I love the child. I just can't predict what the child might need separate and apart and from what I might need. I think it's important to get court involved if there is abuse, name calling. I would talk to children about splitting when they say things like, your mom is taking me to court. It's all your mom's fault. I would talk to my children about, like, daddy struggles to see gray. Daddy sees things in very much black and white. He's a good guy, but he just struggles to see things in gray. And so when these things happen, he says things like, it's all mommy's fault. And I always say to kids like, it's usually not all anybody's fault. Mm-hmm. There's things I can do better. There's things daddies can do better. You're doing a great job. Right. But, maybe sometimes you can clean your room a little better. Like, there's all things we can do better. Right. And so so helping children see and connect to the gray and validating their experience. And then, if your children are getting name called, if your children are getting belittled, if your children are getting physically harmed, if your children are being neglected or they're being their needs are being withheld as a form of punishment, that's all abuse.
Right.
So that's when we protect our children, and we wouldn't just say, well, that's their father. They have a right to see them. That's when we'd say, well, they don't have a right to abuse them. They do have a right to spend time with them if they're gonna respect their rights and autonomy.
I'm gonna go to Teresa's comment, and then we have another comment.
Does that answer the question, Tara? Does that answer the question, baby?
So at what point does it constitute abuse? And not even just for the child, but even for myself.
100%.
So people are talking, I'm going to tie that into a lot of people are saying that either disrespect has been the only thing that has worked, or being told that ignoring is the best thing. And so can you speak a little bit about that? And Briana, I'm going to ask you just slow down just a little bit and talk. People are hanging on to your every word, and I just want to.
I know I talk so fast. My poor students, they're like at the edge of their seats. Take a breath. Okay, so I'm gonna slow down. Sorry, y'all. I like to talk fast. I just do talk fast. Okay, so question again?
About ignoring. People are being told, people are talking about disrespect is the only way that you can, set that boundary or get someone to adhere to you or respect that boundary, or ignoring them and it'll go away.
I don't know what you mean when you say disrespect is the only way. Do you know what you mean?
I'll go back to this comment. So disrespect was the only thing that got his attention. Coming off nice got his ass to kiss.
You got it. So I don't know if I would say disrespect is the only thing that works, but the boundary holding is the only thing that works. There is no empathy. So the only thing that works is behavioral, period. So anytime somebody gets a cookie for something, they're more likely to do it. People do what works, even people without narcissism. And so it's not about nice or mean. It's just about holding the boundary, period. I said no. The answer is no. There will be an escalation because when we're used to a yes, we're going to push back to get a no.
Mm-hmm. And what about ignoring? So
Ignoring is fine. But I would say to the person before I ignore them, I'm not going to tolerate this type of behavior. I'm not going to tolerate this blame. I'm not going to tolerate this name calling. I will speak to you when you speak to me in a respectful tone that does not include blaming or name calling. And then I would go radio silence. And then when they respond in an appropriate way, I would shower them with reinforcement. That was excellent. I really appreciate it. That was really great. Thank you so much. And I would be to your level of comfort or safety, but I would be really engaging when they speak to me respectfully, and I would be immediately disengaged and as when they're disrespectful. Mm-hmm. If it gets disrespectful, I care a lot about you. I'm not gonna have this conversation because you're calling me names and you're blaming. Okay, so you have a really great night, and when we can talk without that, click. Right? Mm-hmm. They may call and call, don't pick up. Right? Maybe a day or two later, you pick up, and they're still blaming. I care about you. I'm not gonna have this conversation. I will not be blamed. I will not be name called. Click. Right? Mm-hmm. I just went through this with one of my patients. There was a huge escalation cycle in a domestic violence situation, and there was very much a sense of like they just kept calling. They had to kick the person out. They just kept calling and name calling and name calling. So she just kept hanging up, and I was just like, "You're doing a great job. You're doing it. It feels terrible. She feels terrible."
When we talk about how that can be a form of abuse, like
it is.
Giving that its proper title, that is abuse.
It's verbal abuse. Right. Here's the thing too. This is an important tip. I would never go to a person with narcissism's house without a way to leave immediately. That's how you're going to set the boundary. Okay. So if there's no trains running and there's no lifts and you don't have a car, you're not going over there. right? But I set certain limits with certain narcissism in my life by like, one of the things is I will not go over there without a vehicle. So I'm cool. And if they're cool, we're cool, right? But if they start to get disrespectful or verbally abusive, I'm leaving immediately, right? Because people do what works and people stop doing what doesn't work. And if they're not getting a code for the behavior, they'll escalate initially and then they'll stop.
Okay. I want to go to 2 final comments. Everyone, I mean, this is like, so we're definitely having Dr. Bree come back on for a part 2. I want to go to Rock's comment and then also Ashira's comment. One of the things that I've seen when setting boundaries with someone with narcissism, that they punish by withdrawing love, financial help, or emotional support. Is this
100%?
Okay.
100%. So that's an extinction burst. We just talked about that, right? Like that, the behavior, if you've reliably vended after somebody did a series of behaviors, they're more likely to do those behaviors. When you stop reliably vending, they're going to escalate. So that just happened in the situation I'm talking about as well with my patient, right? When this happened and then they're calling and naming and blaming, then the next step was they removed financial support. And then my patient called me fucking freaking out. Like, they drained the bank account. I said, hold steady, girl. You can't buckle now, because if you buckle now, what will you teach them? I'll teach them to drain the bank account. And that's how they get what they want from me. Do you like them draining the bank account? No. Then don't buckle now. Because if you buckle now, you'll teach them that this is exactly how you'll get what you want from me. And people just do what works. Okay. So yes, they will absolutely withdraw. We call that passive aggression. Passive aggression is aggression through inactivity. I call it the take the toys and leave your sandbox defense, right? But we should expect that, and we should be ready for this escalation. And the most important thing is, if we're not ready, don't set the boundary. And if we're ready, we better white knuckle that thing until the wheels fall off, because it will eventually. Right? People do what works and they stop doing what works. If this stuff stops working, they will stop doing it.
And then I want to go to Shira's comment, and hearing you say that, it almost makes me think of preparing yourself for and creating your own village of support. I need support as I'm setting this boundary, whether that is therapy for myself, which I am a huge advocate of, right? Because friends can support so much, but I need someone to process this through. If I need some legal support, if it's becoming emotional or physically abusive to me and my child. And so I would be remiss without saying, as I am navigating this relationship, as I am strengthening my boundary muscle, and this goes into Christina, your comment too, that this could be heavy for a lot of people. I want to make sure that I am as emotionally and mentally stable as possible. That's not going to come from a 1-hour conversation with Dr. Bree, right? That's going to come by me actively investing in my mental, emotional well-being. So if I need to see a therapist, I'm going to do that before I set the boundary, because I want muscle.
You need to be fortified. No, you need to be fortified, because what you're going to end up doing, this is really unfortunate, but what people without the fortification and preparation for this end up doing, that's why it's so critical, the boundary piece that we're going to do. I do so much boundary work in my private practice, because people must be fortified. Unfortunately, what people will do is, without the fortification and support, they'll start to set the boundaries. They'll have all this guilt, things will escalate, they will buckle, and through the best of intentions, they will end up setting up a worse and worse and worse and more escalated cycle for themselves. Right. So you've got to be ready for this thing. It's like, I don't want to think of it this way, because I don't want to think of some way negative about it.
Slow down, Bree.
I don't want to think about it this way, because I don't want to think negatively about people with narcissism, because again, it's just not their fault. They're good people who were born with a deficit. And so I think about it like going to battle, though. You know, it's like you wouldn't just go to battle on a random Tuesday because you watched, a History Channel documentary about it. You would make sure that you've got the strategy. You would make sure that you've got the resources. And if you don't have the resources, you don't go to battle. Something that you said, this is 2 things that are really important with the boundaries. I would not start with the narcissist in your life. I would start with the telemarketer. Okay. Right. I would start with out to in. I would start with relationships that are further out, and then move it into harder and harder and closer relationships. Okay. My mother does not have narcissism, but she did not raise me to have a bunch of boundaries. My mom struggles with boundaries. Okay. And so when I was doing my boundary work, I had to start out to in, and I didn't start setting boundaries with my mom until I'd had a lot of practice and fortification and support. My mom is lovely. She's done such a good job and this is the thing, people will get where the line is. They will do it. And especially if they don't have a choice. Okay. And so, my mom got with the program. She's so sweet. She still doesn't even maybe love my boundaries, but she totally supports and respects them. Okay. Also, this is important about boundaries. I want you to think, a lot of times we think about putting the wall with the other. I think it's also important to understand it more conceptually as standing in solidarity with the self. More than about keeping the other out, it's about really holding on to yourself and not throwing yourself off the cliff every time somebody needs something from you. It's like standing side by side, arm in arm, like, nah, I got this girl. I'm not going to just, squander her out and, whatever, basically pimp her out to whatever. Like, I'm going to stand and protect her because her needs matter and she matters. So it's really about standing in solidarity with the self as much as it is about creating that safe space for between you and another. All relationships require boundaries.
All of them.
Every single one. And the ones that require the most boundaries.
Mm-hmm. She was asking, I was always told that there's no pill for personality disorder. Is there truly any effective measure you can take to deal with someone with a personality disorder?
No, I mean, okay, let me answer the question. Yes, there are effective measures one can take in dealing with the narcissist, with the person with narcissism in their life. No, there is no pill to treat it. It's a character pathology. It's hard to treat a character. It's a personality, right? It's a way of being in the world. But there are some cool treatment. Here's the thing. With narcissism, let me back up for a second. For simplicity's sake, we'll say there's two types of symptoms, okay? There's something called an ego-syntonic symptom and there's something called an ego-dystonic symptom, okay? So an ego-dystonic symptom is a symptom that most of us have that we go to therapy for. So it makes us feel bad, it makes us feel sad, it makes us feel anxious. So, depression produces ego-dystonic symptoms. Anxiety produces ego-dystonic symptoms. PTSD, we get ego-dystonic symptoms. And that displeasure, that dystopia, that dysfunction motivates us for treatment. And so people with dystonic symptoms are highly motivated for treatment because they feel so bad, right? The problem with narcissism is that the symptoms are what we call ego-syntonic. So instead of creating a lot of discomfort in the organism, they work. It works pretty well for the organism, right? So if I flip a table and you do what I want, this is working well, right? If I blame you and I don't have any other blame, this is working well for me too. And so the motivating factor that gets us to go to therapy, gets us to pay all that money, gets us to do the hard look at ourselves and change, like that internal motivator isn't there for people with narcissism because they're not only are their symptoms not terribly upsetting to them, but they kind of get what they want a lot of the time. And so for that reason, it's very hard. And then they don't feel the other, they don't feel the other. So they don't necessarily think that they have a big problem and they don't necessarily feel that you're so upset with them. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard for them to stay motivated in treatment. And then we're back to that shame base, right? Where you start scratching at that and they can really have a hard time functioning well in therapy over time. There's one really effective treatment that's very short-term and very skill-based. And I think it's a great treatment for people. But again, that motivation is tough because people with narcissism don't see themselves as the problem. I'm fine, you're fine. You're just sensitive, right? So it takes a lot of ownership and responsibility and motivation and sustained energy to go to therapy. And that's sometimes lacking in folks with narcissism. And so, but the great therapy is called dialectical behavioral therapy. It's called DBT. Yep. Marshall Linehan created it. And it's a very short term. It has a mindfulness component. It has a acceptance. Yep. And it's some boundary setting components and it helps people basically regulate. It helps them manage that splitting. We talked about the all black, all white, no gray. But again, the motivation this will also happen when folks with narcissism go to therapy too, is like, they'll go for a little while, like, okay, I'm good. The person said I was great. This has happened to me a lot in my work where we'll do couples therapy and we start with one individual. They're, talking about, they got ego-dystonic symptoms. So they can't wait to get in there and talk. And then we switch our attention to the person in the couple that has narcissism, and very quickly you're like, we don't need to do therapy anymore. That's happened a lot in couples therapy, where then when it's time to look at the person with narcissism, they don't want to do it anymore and they quit therapy. It's happened a lot. So it's really challenging to treat this disorder. It's very challenging for these individuals to sustain treatment. There is no pill for it. And again, like dialectical behavioral therapy is a really good practical skill building thing, but it's just the motivation is hard.
As we get ready to wrap up, and I want to thank everyone for touching. I want to touch on Sharice and Dana's comment. I have survived, and also Sparkle's comment. I have survived someone with narcissism, but it has left me feeling anxious. I feel sick in my stomach. How do I cope on the other side? How do I support myself on the other side?
That's a great question. Okay. So it can be very, very traumatizing to have narcissism in your life. You might actually even have post-traumatic stress disorder. I've treated many people for post-traumatic stress disorder.
And I think it's good that we just pause there and just acknowledge that narcissism can cause trauma for me.
100%. Mm-hmm. And this is really interesting. Most people who are at least physically abusive have narcissism. I won't say all. Sometimes it can be substance abuse that gets you there. Sometimes it can be some other type of mental illness, but it's really hard to abuse somebody with empathy on board because it's painful, right? And so people who are abusive often struggle with empathy. That's kind of how they're able to do it. So yes, I've treated a lot of people for bona fide post-traumatic stress disorder after having a narcissistic husband. I've treated people. PTSD and trauma aren't the same. PTSD is a type of trauma manifestation. I've treated people with like childhood trauma around parents with narcissism. So one of the most important things we're doing when we're recovering from trauma is twofold. One is, well, threefold. One is it's important to feel your feelings. Okay, feelings get a bad rap. Feelings are indicators, no more, no less. We are designed and built to feel them. We have a million years of evolution directing this thing. You're going to be okay. All right, but we try to hold our feelings back, especially with kids in the mix. Right? And we're scared that if we let the floodgates open, we're going to be flooded. What in reality is when we hold on to the feeling, the body just, okay, well, I'll just hold on to it until she's ready. Right? And we just keep stuffing and stuffing and stuffing. And then I think this is what nervous breakdowns are made of. I think they're made of stuffing and stuffing and stuffing and stuffing and stuffing. And finally the body just purges. And people are terrified to feel these feelings. And then they get very overwhelmed and they think they're losing their mind when in fact they're gaining health through feeling the feelings. And so it's really important that people who are recovering from narcissism, if they can afford and have the capacity to go to therapy, go to therapy. You're going to need to recover, right? Number two, you got to feel your feelings. You got to feel the rage. But you got to watch the thoughts, right? If you're thinking things like, I failed, I'm terrible, those aren't the feelings you need to be feeling. You need to be feeling the feelings that anybody would feel as a result of what you're going through. So sad, angry, terrified, right? So feeling the feelings. Then the second thing is you got to watch the thoughts. There's a lot of self-blame that shows up in trauma because we're looking for a way to control the outcome of uncontrolled, especially really uncontrollable people. So we'll blame the self. We'll say, they flipped it. This is it. So a child comes home, dad comes home from work, he's had a terrible day, child sets the table, flips the table, child says, that was my fault. I didn't set the table well enough. Next time I'll set it perfectly and dad won't flip the table. And so we do a lot of self-blaming in trauma because we're trying to control or predict a bad outcome. And so after we're leaving narcissism, we may have been gaslighted quite a bit. We may have had a lot of verbal abuse, but we also may blame ourselves a lot because that's how we manage the uncontrollability of the other, right? It's like this fantasy of control in the self. I won't say something that set them off. When I say the wrong thing and they go off, it's my fault. And so we don't want to feel those feelings. Self-blame messages, we want to taper back on any of those thoughts and any of those feelings. In order for there to be blame, you need intention and action. If you just have action and no intention, blame's not the right thing. Sometimes we can have really good intentions and have a bad outcome. Sometimes we can have okay intentions and have this incredible outcome. Outcome and intentions are not always significantly related. Right. And so it's really important to not be blaming the self, watching that kind of self-talk, telling yourself you're a good person, you did the best you could. Educating yourself about narcissism will be so therapeutic. There are thousands.
The name of the book again? You said the hate.
It's called I Hate You, Don't Leave Me.
I hate you, don't leave me. Someone put that in the comments. I hate you, don't leave me.
I don't even know who the author is. It's really, really good. There's so many podcasts about surviving narcissism as well. But I will say this, just be careful when you're listening to these books because they will talk about narcissism so poorly. And I just don't think these people need to be vilified because if you can stay compassionately connected to the disorder, not necessarily put yourself, never abuse, but if you can stay compassionately connected to the disorder, it will help you keep your footing in the whole.
Conceptualize. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. One last thing, I think that I am not getting paid by any of these people. These are really good resources. There's a really good book called The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. I recommend it to almost 100% of my patients, and I've literally, everyone I've recommended it to has always loved it. And I think that's a really good place to start if you're having a lot of mind chatter that's leading to self-blame, depression, anxiety.
It's hard again. Someone put this in the comment.
The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. And it's by, let's see really quickly here. It's such a good book.
Thank you, Shamia. And also thank you, Sharice, The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion.
Yeah, by Christopher Germer, Germer, right? Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is avoidance. After we have feeling our feelings, watching the thoughts, right? Not going into those self-blame thoughts. And then the third thing is avoidance. After we've had any type of trauma, we tend to avoid what we got traumatized by. So after we have a relationship with narcissism, we may avoid all relationships because we're so terrified. But that will actually make our fear grow over time, not shrink. And so it's important to, I smile because I think it's important to continue to continue to try to have relationships with people, because if you don't, you're going to get more and more freaked out the longer you go without it. The best way to figure out if you're dealing with narcissism is to set boundaries early and often. I always say you never know who you're messing with until you set a boundary. Okay, so that's a nice protective measure going forward. If you're surviving narcissism, you got to get your boundaries in order, and then you want to always lead with your boundaries. When I meet a new person in my life, I always find a reason to say no immediately, just to see how they're going to react to my no. If I say no and they go, great, I go, great, we're going to be friends, right? If I say no and I get any pushback, I'm like, oh, we're not going to be close, right? I had somebody tell me this too, as like a telltale sign if somebody has narcissism. I don't, it's interesting to think about. That somebody said to me, they'll tell you a sob story very early on, some kind of story about being abused or mistreated. And I'm talking really early, like first, second date. You know, most of us without narcissism who have not been abused, we're not telling our deepest, darkest abuse secrets on date one. Right. And again, they're not doing that to intentionally manipulate us, but it does seem to get us especially us empaths. Right. That's the meat hook, girl. That's it. And now like, right. Doesn't matter, right? Another thing is narcissism is a merry-go-round. Okay, they're not bad people, but it is a merry-go-round. They will come around 12 o'clock again. They will come around 6 o'clock again. They will come around 12. No matter what you do, this thing will keep spinning. Sometimes it will spin faster. Sometimes it will spin slower. But you're never going to stop at 12 o'clock. You're never going to get to 12 and stay there. You're always going to be moving around all the faces, all the numbers on the face of the clock.
Okay. Dr. Bree, is there any other takeaway that if you could leave one takeaway point for co-parenting with a narcissist, surviving a narcissist, anything that you would sum this up into saying to the Dr. Tara community who has tuned in for over an hour, and we're still at almost 70 people strong. So thank you for bringing your expertise.
Sorry I talk so fast, y'all. I'll slow down, but I'm working on it, right? Take-home message I would say is this. People with narcissism are not bad people. Falling in love with someone with narcissism can feel better than almost anything on the planet. You are not a bad person if you fell in love with someone with narcissism. People with narcissism can be talented, charming, good-looking, fun, funny, okay? There's nothing wrong with you. You're not a bad person. There's nothing wrong with them, okay? The world has a lot of diversity in it, and this is one of the ways that we're very, very diverse, and we can learn to manage these differences, right? Like we manage any other difference, right? But you're a good person. You're doing a good job. And sometimes, you know, there's something called post-traumatic growth, right? But sometimes surviving narcissism, not when we're still in the traumatized phase, but when we get outside of it, it can be a really important, growth point for us. And so you're not out of the woods yet. Hang in there. There's beauty to be had. If you have any questions about narcissism specifically, hit me up. I mean, obviously I could talk about this stuff all day and all night. So I love to have people think through it. I love to talk about it. I love to answer questions about it. I encourage you to educate yourself. But you're a good person. You're doing a good job. You're a good mom. You're a good dad. You're a good parent. Okay, we're all doing the best we can. And so have compassion for yourselves and each other.
Yes, and I just want to put out there again, like this topic is so vast, and one of the things that we're going to really buckle in on or hone down on is the importance of setting boundaries, what they are and what they are not. So Dr. Briana has already agreed to come back for a part 2 in June. I think we already set the date, so mark your calendars. I think we set it for June the 11th, another Thursday. Again, I'm setting accommodate her schedule. She has joined us all the way from California. We want to thank you for taking the time out. It's sunny where you are. It's nighttime where we are. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise always as part of the Dr. Tara community. Thank you all so much for tuning in. As always, let's heal together. Again, if I'm dealing with this, then again, my recommendation is find an outlet. Find a professional, a licensed person who can help you through this, so that you can get the healing that you desperately, or that we all desperately need, and more importantly, that we deserve. So thank you all so much.
They say, the Buddha said, you are as deserving of your own loving kindness as any being on the planet.
Yes. I love that. You are as deserving of your own loving kindness as any being on the planet. So yes, it starts with them. So thank you, everyone. As always, let's heal together. Peace.
Thank you.